Hey there, and welcome to the People Who Help People podcast. This is the spot for HR and people ops pros who are all about building better businesses by putting people first. We chat with founders and experts who've been there, done that, and are generous enough to share what actually works. Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hello again. Today I am happy to be speaking with Anya Klimbovskaia, co-founder and COO at Diversio, about future-proofing HR consulting firms in times of disruption. At Diversio, they provide workplace insights and learning solutions to unlock culture intentionally, measurably, and sustainably. Welcome, Anya.
Thank you so much, Craig. It's a pleasure.
Pleasure having you on the podcast today. Anya, can you tell me a little bit more about Diversio? I tried to do it justice, but I don't think that I did.
I actually think that was a very solid job. So maybe I'll steal that for later. But yeah, happy to. So Diversio is predominantly a software company with a consultancy overlay. And what we do is we help organizations collect data from their people, letting them know a little bit more about who their people are, as well as how their people are experiencing the workplace day to day. And once we collect that data, we're able to process and analyze it to generate insights on the potential challenges that those people are facing in the workplace. We do that both at the aggregate level, but also at the individual level. And then once we identify the challenges, we make recommendations on the actions that both HR teams and people leaders should be taking in order to help reinvigorate and optimize their teams for improved performance.
Excellent. So I love that. It's a data-driven approach. Then you're tailoring your recommendations very specifically to what the data is showing us. So I know the HR team is listening, but how about the people leaders? How do you best reach the people leaders so that they pay attention?
In my experience, or at least with the organizations that we work with, we often find that people leaders are motivated to make sure that their teams operate at a high performing level, whether intrinsically because they care about their people or because they also want to, outperform a different team or whatever it is. There is that inherent motivation to succeed. But one of the challenges that managers often face is that they can sometimes be put in a managerial position without necessarily having people leadership experience. And that in itself, the skill of leading people is an incredibly sophisticated and critical skill to be able to develop and facilitate over time. And a lot of times we find that managers potentially struggle with that. What we do is once we identify challenges on a particular team or challenges that a particular individual is facing, we actually have customized nudges and coaching available to managers that will almost give them a bit of a guiding hand, if you will, when it comes to the things that they can and should do to re-energize their people. And so in my experience, again, it's not a question of how do you reach the people leaders, but it's more so how do you enable them? How do you give them a bit of the answer to help them along the way?
So I heard in a recent webinar that you conducted, I heard about these customized, tailored nudges, and I thought it was brilliant because our phones are good at that, right? We'll talk about that red dress, and suddenly you'll see a bunch of ads for that red dress or whatever. Sorry, my wife is shopping right now for an event we got next week. But how do these tailored nudges work? How do you, what are the signals and what's a nudge?
So the way that we approach it, and it's actually a new component of the software that we just launched, is we first and foremost try to understand the employee a little bit better. I colloquially refer to as professional love languages. There's also a very sophisticated psychological framework behind it called Hogan MBPI framework. But effectively, what we do is we first collect data on what intrinsically motivates people to succeed in life, but more specifically within the professional sphere. And those things can be recognition, for example, just having someone tell you you did a good job, or they can be influence, where you want to reach a position of autonomy and self-governance and potentially managing other people. Or those things can be enjoyment, where you just really love showing up to work and, having fun doing the thing that you're good at doing. So we try to learn about that for every single employee. Once we have this information on employees, we also start collecting data, like I mentioned, from employees on a daily basis about their morale. And the questions themselves are fairly innocuous. but they tell us a lot about an employee's experience. So we can ask a question like, were you motivated by something that you were working on this week, or were you excited by a particular accomplishment? And with that, we create a picture of an employee's pulse in the organization. How are they feeling day to day? Are they, you know, feeling mentally engaged? Are they present? Are they excited about the work that they're doing? Or alternatively, are they disengaged? Are they potentially thinking about leaving? Are they, silent quitting, as a kind of a colloquial term for it as well? And as we're collecting this data and this information, if we're feeling that an employee is at risk for something like burnout, we will then go to their manager in the moment and we will say, hey, Craig, your employee Anya, we're starting to pick up something from her that she's feeling potentially a little overwhelmed. Why don't you do a wellness one-on-one with her? And this is how the wellness one-on-one is structured. This is how it looks. This is an email that you could send to her to schedule it and let her know what kind of conversation you'll be having. Or we'll say, hey, Craig, something Anya really values is family time. And she's been really working hard. And again, we're worried that she's approaching burnout. Could you consider giving her a couple of hours to take off early on a Friday? And so these sorts of nudges that we're sharing with managers, they're very practical, they're real time, they're personalized, and they're based on an employee's personality, their motivators, their profile. And so it helps managers understand not just the problem itself, because a lot of the time, potentially there might not be visibility into it, but also what they can do to help solve the problem before it becomes something that is irreversible.
So I really like this idea because certainly engagement surveys, pulse surveys have been around for a long time, but they tend to give us this aggregate data, and we tend to develop these generic action plans for improving the whole team's morale. But I like how this is personalized, and it sounds somewhat unobtrusive in that it's a simple spot question and can capture that moment. Even though I tend to be a very optimistic employee, well, I've been a little down lately, and it's time for a nudge. But then you pair that with not everybody is sophisticated enough to know how to respond to that. So it's not sophisticated, poor word, but in your leadership tenure, maybe you don't know. We don't always know how to address every situation. So having a set of possible solutions or ways to address it, or ways to re-engage, ways to reach out and just say, I care, or start a conversation, I think is very smart. How's it working for the companies that have employed this, that have used it for a while? What do they report 3 months in, 6 months in? Do the managers feel more equipped? Do the employees, importantly, what's it done with the retention rates, et cetera?
Yeah. All great questions. I will potentially disappoint you with some of the answers because we're still very early and preliminary in testing this new software. So, as you know, Diversio is legacy software. We've been doing this for about 8 years now. It's quite sophisticated engagement software with a demographic overlay. So we collect data on employees' backgrounds, demographics, and pair it with engagement software. And that's exactly like you said, collected annually. It gives you the full picture. We bring sophisticated plans and recommendations to HR. We help them implement them organization wide. Tons of case studies and success stories on that. But this current software, we're calling it Optimo. It's very new, and we actually developed it this summer in response to some of the challenges that we saw coming out of this sort of more traditional approach to engagement. Some of those, of course, as you know, being the staleness of the data, because collecting data once a year, 6 months in, you really don't have any idea what's going on in the company. Or the over reliance a lot of the time on HR to be responsible for the culture across the organization, which is very difficult. HR creates the infrastructure for success, programs and policies and employee supports, but ultimately day to day, a manager plays a huge role in how an employee is going to be feeling. So we saw that, we created Optimo, and right now we're in the middle of piloting actually with a few organizations that we're really, really excited about. And the pilots, the preliminary insights from the pilots are quite strong and positive. Our true metrics of success with the pilots are going to be exactly like you said, the uptake in retention, uptake in reduction in things like absenteeism, reduction in things like disability leave. Those are all of the things that we're tracking. We're, like I said, seeing very, very strong preliminary results.
Something just popped into my head, so I'll have to ask. How are you targeting this? Do you target it with a positive message, make your strong culture even stronger, or with a maybe slightly negative message of, burnout problems, lots of absenteeism, you need Optimo? What's how are you going to market?
We're doing both. I think one of the really interesting uh, data points that a lot of the time is unspoken, is this prevalence of mental health conditions and challenges that are now almost ubiquitous across all sectors. Diversio started before the pandemic. Throwback. Hopefully, I didn't trigger anyone with mentioning the pandemic. But Diversity started in 2018 before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, we've been collecting this demographic data. And part of the demographic data that we collect from employees and organizations is mental health. And now, consistently, we're seeing that the prevalence of mental health has dramatically increased across all workplaces. I just did the math with the team on our latest numbers for 2025 and 2024. 28% on average is the number of employees in an organization that identifies having mental health conditions. That's huge. Anxiety and depression being two of the most prevalent. And for clarity, are the companies that we work with are large enterprise for the most part. So we work with Honda, Porsche, you know, we work with Microsoft, we work with UNICEF, we work with Disney. Like, these are large organizations. And so this is a big problem. A lot of companies, in fact, most companies are experiencing. And I think that the idea for us is, how do we recognize that? And then how do we engage again in a way that's meaningful? And so knowing that almost 30% of our employees are identifying as having mental health conditions, we need to make sure that they have the supports around them. Of course, absenteeism is going to be higher. Of course, things like disability leave are going to be higher. Actually, for employees with mental health conditions, absenteeism is around 4% of their year or their working days. For employees without, it's about 1.2%. And so a tool like Optimo, something that measures, understands, is able to support, is able to help reduce and manage some of these realities, it really ends up quite closely tied to your bottom line, but also to just the general health of your people.
Sometimes I wonder, when you say 28% identify as currently feeling a mental health challenge, do we just live in a more anxious time? Is it greater awareness, or some combination thereof? But I don't want you to answer that question. What I do want to do is go back to the topic, which is, how do you future-proof an HR consulting firm in times of disruption? And I think these are disruptive times. So can you speak a little bit about, let's take a little bit of a step back, any disruptions in the last, let's say calendar year, that have come your way, and how you've pivoted either your messaging or your approach? And is this a regional challenge or is this a global challenge?
So, elephant in the room. Of course, with a name like Diversio, it does suggest what we've always believed and continue to believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion as an organization. For us, it's not a controversial topic, truly. It's something that's quite simple, which is, in order to be successful and effective as a business or an enterprise, you should be representing the communities or the population that you're trying to reach, or you're trying to sell to, which implies being as diverse as that population, having those different mix of people working for you. And then in the same vein, you should make sure that those people are empowered to do their best job, which means understanding potential challenges or unique experiences that folks might be facing, and just trying to address any barriers that could exist in the workplace to unlock those folks' full potential. Of course, I think that despite the fact, and I might be naive, that view is not super controversial, I think that the entire idea of DEI as an acronym and what it stands for has faced some scrutiny over the last year, and it has been politicized more than maybe it had been previously, especially in the United States. That is not the case in other parts of the world. In fact, we're seeing countries like Europe, continents like Europe, double down in a big way with emerging regulations such as CSRD on diversity, equity, and inclusion practices that are upheld across enterprise. We're seeing something similar in Canada. In South America, there's a big double down on DEI as a concept and as a practice. Of course, not necessarily the case in the United States. For the most part, we have seen the companies that we work with continue to want to work with us. We have seen the majority of companies, both who are our clients and outside of our immediate network, continue the work that they've been doing, not because they are necessarily trying to make a political stance. In fact, most of the time that is not the case, but because they're generally seeing the dividend of having done so for many years. The work has undergone a bit of a rebrand, I think, for certain organizations. They might be getting creative with the way that they call their DEI approach. We've seen people use people and culture. We've seen people use workforce optimization, which is kind of more clinical term, I suppose, but same underlying principles. So whatever people do call it, we are seeing the ethos of it continue in a large part. Of course, there have been companies who have rolled back practices in a meaningful way, but they are in the minority. So yes, we've definitely experienced some disruption, I would say. But for us, what we do, and even this new product that we have launched that is not quote unquote DEI branded, the underlying principle is the same. Understand who your people are, understand how they feel, optimize both of those things, and you will see the results that you want.
So it sounds like you've pivoted some of your messaging. You've certainly paid attention to how companies are rebranding their efforts. Has it caused you to make any other changes within the organization?
We definitely discussed it, and I think we ultimately landed on staying true to what we've done over the years. I think we adjusted some of our marketing language potentially. Don't quote me. I should bring in our VP of revenue here who will be able to speak much more articulately to it. I think that potentially we started using words like people and culture more, but ultimately I still freely use words like diversity and inclusion. And again, I don't think it is incendiary in any way when used in the way that I just described it.
And I did notice a video by your co-founder specifically talking to the topic and being rather forthright about, like you said, let's talk about the elephant in the room and talk about how the underlying concepts are enduring. And if anything, we need to double down. In this age of other disruptions, I happen to be in the States and we happen to have a government shutdown at the moment. That in the face of changing employment markets with is AI going to take my job and all of that? It seems to me that there's a premium on good leadership wherever you go. And what you're enabling is more timely than ever.
Exactly.
Okay, one other pivot. We talked earlier about working with partners, specifically venture capital firms. Could you talk a little bit about how you've had some success with partnerships in that regard?
Yeah, definitely. I'm happy to. So, in our chat before we started recording, I had mentioned that a good deal of our clients are actually investors. So, venture capital, definitely, but we also work with large institutional investors. So, we work with pension funds, endowment funds. We work with, State Street, Natixis, Generali, CalPERS, et cetera, public markets, private markets. You get the picture. The idea why we work with so many investors is that investors want to optimize for the performance of their portfolios, which include other companies. And investors have also, a lot of them have seen the dividends that are innate to having representative workplaces with empowered employees when it comes to, call it inclusion, call it belonging, call it, whatever it is that you'd like to call it. And so we work a lot with investors who actually use our software to deploy with their portfolio companies and track the way that their portfolio companies are performing on these sort of like quote unquote people metrics. That's why we kind of have had the ability to diffuse the software in kind of in a scalable way, and also report back to investors on the way that their portcos are doing and performing. Some of them have strict requirements when they come to their portfolio companies and say that we expect engagement and inclusion to be at a particular level. Some are just monitoring, but this is something that's very interesting to investors, and I think speaks volumes of the fact that this is actually a business imperative.
I like that. Again, as we said, not only is human capital going to continue to be important, but at a time when we're spending too much time talking about technology, I think companies are going to start differentiating themselves by bragging about things like how well they're doing from a human wellness perspective writ large. So providing that data, I think, is extremely smart and obviously recognized by your partners in that regard. One other thing I forgot to mention, in one of the content pieces, your co-founder talked about the bootstrapping days. I suspect you're past that, but any lessons learned from where you started to where you are today to where you'd like to get to? Talk just a little bit about the growth journey and some of the things that are your favorite memories, whether they're or favorite for whatever reason.
Oh God,
Remember when to
there's
I never want to do that again.
so many. And this is a good question for a glass of wine, I think.
Okay.
And it's like a longer 2 hour heart to heart. But yes, that's correct. Like I mentioned, my co-founder and I started the business in 2018, and we ended up raising venture capital once we had gotten the company off the ground in a meaningful way in 2021 from our wonderful investors at First Round Capital. Could not recommend them more. But I think one of the big things that we learned is hustle over the years, and something that Laura, my co-founder, refers to in me as rejection amnesia, because I have a fundamental tendency, it seems, to just forget the amount of times you will get rejected as an entrepreneur, and continue having blind faith and belief that the product and the business and the software is revolutionary. And I think when you're starting out with any business, that is something that you must have, because you're going to get told no a lot before you suddenly start hearing yes. And I think thankfully we are over that hump and have been for many years, and now we're growing. We were actually excited to acquire a company last year that focuses on learning and development for organizations, and so the business has become a lot more end to end. But yeah, back in that day, we definitely had a lot of hustle and grit, I think.
Hustle, grit, and rejection amnesia.
Yeah.
Good things to remember. I've enjoyed the conversation today. If others who are listening to this would like to reach out to you and find out more, what are some ways that you would recommend that they get in contact?
Honestly, wherever you find me, of course, diversio.com is our website, but please reach out on LinkedIn or over email. I'm always looking forward to meeting people and chatting about this topic.
Great. Anya, thank you so much. Happy that you were able to make this podcast, and thank you so much for the conversation today. I really enjoyed hearing about your continued focus on the health and wellness of each individual in every organization, and how you're helping unlock not only tailored nudges to check in on them, but also to grow that leader employee relationship and make that stronger. So
Thank you
thank you
so
so
much.
much.
Thank you.